I've caught more giants on a rodent than any other bait flipping in that pre-spawn, spawn period. It's just something about that profile. It doesn't have any action. It catches great big ones. And when that water's just a little bit cooler and they've just got out there and thinking about spawning, it's hard to beat. It also goes through cover the best. No matter if I'm punching Salvania mats that are in bushes, or it just goes through really easy. And I can just change the weight on it for whatever the cover is. As it warms on up and we've started to move back in the back of everything, realistically, I more or less go to the rage bug when fish are aggressive and the water's warm, like above 60, 65, 70, and they're out there spawning. There's some garden fry and they're starting to move around, because the deal is it swims. It's great in when I'm flipping super shallow water, because it hangs in the water. I can put it on the same size weight that I put the rodent on, and it'll fall at half the speed because the legs draw so much water. Has almost the same effect as the rage crawl does on the back of the jig. It's pulling water, so it's holding the bait up.
What's your starting weight?
You know, that depends on water depth. Like, so whatever weight it depends on what we're doing. You know, if I'm punching with that rodent through mats that are hung up in bushes, or it could just be a lake that doesn't have any, I mean, that could vary anywhere from 5/8 to 1.5 ounces. You know, so it just kind of depends on the cover. If I'm just fishing clean bushes, let's call them 2 to 5 feet of water, on the rodent, typically a 3/8. It falls pretty fast on a 3/8. A rodent with a 3/8 ounce slip sinker has about the same rate of fall as a 3/4 ounce hack attack jig, because nothing draws. Like draws no water, so it falls like a bullet. So I have a tendency to lean lighter on the weight. And earlier in the year, I leaned lighter on the weight, even in deeper bushes. Again, even if it's a situation where I can't use the jig and the cover's too thick, regardless of whatever I'm doing, early on, the lightest weight I can get by with to get through that stuff, if it's thick. Does that make sense? I want it easing in there. I don't want it to blow through when the water's cold. It has an opposite effect typically on fish. You blow in the summertime, if I'm punching mats and I could get through with 1 ounce, I might use 1.5 ounces because I think it generates bites. It just blows through and they attack it. It has an opposite effect on them when the water's cold. That's one reason I don't like a big, if I gotta use a giant weight to get through, a lot of times I'll control the rate of fall for that, because I find a lot of times when the water's cold, it causes them to get out of the way. They just don't react the same when the water's cold as they do when it's hot. So if I can get through that stuff, I might have to work my bait around a little bit to use a 5/8 or a 3/4. I'll do that because I want to ease it in there on them. I don't want it to blow. I don't need them to react. I want them to get a chance to look at it and not run off. Sometimes fish in cold water is spooky. And a lot of times I even know, I've had this before, I'll be punching down the line of thick stuff like that, and I'll see my line never get and if you're using a weight too big, you'll get those kind of bites. Like you'll be like, I know I got a bite, and I picked up and there wasn't anything there. And you'll go a little farther and you'll see that line just do something weird again. You're like, I know I got a bite. And typically when that happens, I'll just put me a little weight on there, smallest one I can get by with, and then I'll start catching them. Weight's too big, it's falling too fast. It's almost to the deal like where they bite it and they're afraid of it. So if I use that smaller weight. So earlier in the year, we start flipping early, especially pre-spawning before. I try to get by with as light a weight as I can fish efficiently, if that makes sense. You know, if I'm flipping bushes out there in 6 or 7 feet of water, you know, I want to get in there on the bottom. I want to get to the bottom, so I'll increase the weight a little bit. But if it's something where they're up and that thing is going to fall by them, light as possible. Just fishing on the bottom is different.
Your own weights, have you messed around much with the newer, like arrowhead flat style flipping punching weights versus the traditional punching and flipping weights? I mean, the tungsten.
I use a Strike King tour grade tungsten weight. I've been fishing so long. I started with lead. When they had a needle nose weight, I went through that and all that. For me personally, as long as it's, you know, Gamakatsu has a bunch of like different styles, and I've tried them all, and I don't know that they make that. I haven't noticed yet. I'm not saying they don't. I just have not noticed yet that weight styles really, you know what I mean, or get you any more bites on that deal. The main thing is if it gets through, because it's not about the weight, it's about the bait. Because really the weight is just a tool to get that bait to that fish, because the bait is where they see, what they're want to eat.
Are you still using the rubber nail?
Yeah, I pegged that's another thing. I probably need to say that. So when I'm flipping plastics, 100% of the time I peg my weight. And I use a rubber peg. I don't use a bobber stopper. I've had some bad issues with bobber stoppers, some break-offs and other things. Tungsten is so hard that using that rubber peg, it protects my line from that weight. That rubber peg absorbs some of that shock. And I've experimented with the bobber stopper. That's just not mine. The other thing I like about it is when I peg my weight with that rubber peg and pull it down, my weight's not hitting my bait every time when I'm punching through that mat. It seems like it keeps the hook from punching through my bait quicker too. If that makes sense. I see guys use a bobber stopper on top. Well, there's nothing controlling the weight on the bottom. So when I pull it out of that mat, every time it's pulling down on my bait, if that makes sense. I like the rubber peg. And they make several different sizes. And I will say this, when I peg my weight with that rubber peg, it is not pegged tight. They make pegs that are bigger, that come in different, so it's a different size from the beginning to the back. And so when I pull it into my weight, I like for my weight to be able to, without a lot of resistance, just be able to pull it up and down the line, if that makes sense. Now sometimes I say that, and sometimes in practice, it's kind of like what Nick was talking about, putting a shrink wrap on. When I'm practicing and I'm punching mats, I'll pull that thing down tight where it doesn't move. But when I'm trying to catch the fish, I don't want it that snug. But when I'm just practicing and shaking off bites, I pull it where it's that weight. And then I can get by with the same piece of plastic for a lot longer, because that weight has never pushed down on there and pushed the eye of that hook through the top of it. But that's the big reason I prefer the rubber peg. I've even experimented back with a toothpick. And to me, using a toothpick is better than using a bobber stop. Protects my line better. There's no chance of me getting cut off. Because that tungsten is so hard, and so much happens when I set the hook, and when that weight turns on that line, if there's nothing to protect it, there is a chance that even, now all the weights are powder coated inside and have, to protect your line from the tungsten. It's still, I feel better. I still the chance of breaking the line with that tungsten weight if you don't do that. This would be a perfect place to flip right there. That's great cover right now. Now I'm fishing for a fish that's spawning on that cypress tree. That same fish would have been in that mat before they spawned. So when that fish come up the sun, if I'd have fished that same pocket before they were spawning earlier, like now, I would have keyed on that mat that was behind it and not on that cypress tree. Because the best cover was the mat, not the cypress tree. But when that fish come out to spawn, he doesn't want to be in that shade and he wants to be out there where it's full sunshine. So he came out and spawned on that cypress tree. There's also a pretty nice one on that tree too to go along with that male. But that's a perfect example of the difference in fishing the same place in all stages of the spawn. Because pre-spawn, I would have keyed more on that hyacinth mat, not on that cypress tree.